Hello, everybody. Just a quick announcement to say that, excitingly, we are going to be in London for a special live podcast event as part of Sundance Film Festival in London on Saturday, the 11th of June at 7 p.m. If you are in London or within reach of London, then please come along and watch a very special live episode being recorded in front of an audience. And we've got some very special guests, including some filmmakers who have got some incredible new horror films that are premiering at Sundance that week. It's going to be a very special event, and there's going to be drinks in the bar afterwards. I would love to meet some of you guys and hang out with some of you as well. So if you fancy coming to be involved in a rare live podcast recording of the evolution of horror, and you are in London or within reach of London, then grab yourself a ticket. Just head over to evolutionofhorror.com/Sundance. That's evolutionofhorror.com/Sundance, which should redirect you straight to the ticket page. And I will link all of the details to this in the show notes. In 1922, 100 years ago, German director F.W. Murnau made what was arguably the first screen adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. He didn't have permission to adapt it legally, so changed many of the character names and a few of the story beats. It being a silent film also meant that it lost much of the wordy dialogue from the novel and stripped the story back to rely more on striking German expressionist visuals and a truly terrifying monster in the form of Count Orlok. Similarly, a decade later, Danish director Carl Theodor Dreyer decided to make his own vampire movie. Like Nosferatu, he relied less on dialogue and conventional narratives and more on striking, terrifying, nightmarish visuals. To this day, both of these strange European art house nightmares remain two of the boldest and most terrifying vampire movies ever made. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of the vampire, as we discuss Carl Theodor Dreyer's Vampyr and F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres, one series at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 8th series exploring the evolution of vampire movies, and this is part 3. This week's episode is sponsored by patron and friend of the pod, Rebecca McCallum, and in this week's episode, as that intro suggested, we're going to be looking at two of the earliest vampire movies ever made. That's Vampyr from 1932 and Nosferatu from 1922. So joining me to discuss these two vintage classics is an expert in vintage classics. He was here last series discussing Village of the Damned and the Quatermass Experiment with me, and I'm very glad to have him back. He is an actor, writer, and all-round classic horror expert. It's James Swanton. Hello, James.
Hello, Mike. How are you?
I am very good, thanks. How have you been? Have you been busy?
I've been almost inhumanly busy of late, and that's good because I so seldom play human beings. So I feel the universe is somewhat atoning for the dirty it's done nearly every member of the theatrical profession for the last few years. So
absolutely, yes.
Yeah, I mean, there was a point a few months ago where I was simultaneously making 3 different horror films.
Any that you can tell us about?
2 of the 3.
Okay,
Unfortunately, I can't tell listeners about the 3rd, but that will be a very, very big deal when it does finally come out of the shadows.
Oh.
I worked on Host 2 years ago, and I didn't know if that would be a big deal. This is a different case where you're working on something and you know it will make the hearts of horror fans sing, but I am sworn to silence, unfortunately. But what I can talk about is the other 2. So I did a short film called Stop Dead.
Lovely.
Which was due to be made pre-pandemic, and I think that is going to be really fantastically terrifying. It's directed by Emily Greenwood, and she's brilliant, and it was co-produced by Doug Cox, who did Host and Dashcam, and Jude Goldrake, who produced The Thing That Ate the Birds. So that's all very exciting. And I've also finished work now on Stop Motion, another film with the word stop in the title, weirdly. Unconnected, but connected by me. And that's the first feature film from Robert Morgan, whose short films are absolutely fantastic, febrile, nightmarish animations like The Cat with Hands and Bobby Yare. So I think that's going to be tremendously exciting. It's a lovely, lovely feeling to, really feel you're working on very exciting projects.
That's very cool. And of course, James, you're in the new Rob Savage film Dashcam, right? Which is finally getting its UK release in the next couple of weeks.
And I suppose by the time this goes out, your screening will almost certainly have sold out. But
oh, well, let's hope so. Yes, at the time we're recording this, there's about 10 seats left. So yes, hopefully it will be sold out very soon, which is, again, very exciting. But it's amazing, isn't it, how after just one film, Rob Savage has become such a name. Rob Savage and Jed Shepherd and everyone involved, really. But
indeed.
To the point where,
And Gemma Hurley.
Yeah, Gemma Hurley, the whole team that brought us Host. It's like, that's it. Everyone's so excited to see what they've come up with next, I think,
No, it's wonderful. And lowly sorts like me can only hope to cling to their coattails until I'm thrown off by a high wind,
No, never.
No, it's good to see talent shining through and getting its just desserts. And, likewise, I'm very, very excited to see what they all come up with next.
Well, there we go. So, enough about new stuff, James. I mean, let's rewind back 100 years, shall we?
How dare you ask me to talk about the 21st century?
I know. Can you
Why am I even here?
We've got two absolute gems to discuss, but first of all, let me ask you a bit about what you think of this subgenre, vampires. Obviously, such a popular subgenre in horror, and one that has it's perfect for this podcast, really, because it really has changed and evolved so much from where it started to where it's at now. But what are your thoughts generally, James, on the vampire subgenre?
Oh, I mean, I can't help but be an enormous fan of it. It really couldn't be otherwise as a horror fan. Because, the vampire film it so often seems like the very broadest subgenre within the already incredibly broad church of horror, doesn't it?
Yes.
I mean, certainly for me growing up, Dracula was just ubiquitous. It was seemingly everywhere in my childhood. And,
yes.
From the very first time I heard about Dracula, there was always this really exciting sense that, there are other ghosts, there are other monsters, but Dracula, he is the king of the monsters. Mm-hmm. I think it's something that comes from... Funnily enough, I think it probably comes from Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, where you have Bela Lugosi back as Dracula, and there is this sense of him being the ringmaster in that film.
Yes, that's right.
And, of course, this is something that translates to other media. It's there in the Anno Dracula series from old Kim Newman, of course, and, you can find it in the Castlevania video games, where Dracula is the big nasty that the entire thing's leading up to. And
yes.
Yeah, so I was always very excited by anything Dracula-centred as a child. I mean, for me as a born and bred Yorkshireman, Whitby really wasn't too far away, and it was always just magical to be able to go there and, have people point out, these are the steps that Dracula went up when he transformed into a dog. Here's the harbour where the ship crashed. Here's the abbey. Here's the graveyard where Lucy was preyed on and all of that. But
wow, yeah.
I think for my Dracula fascination, I really have to particularly credit my beloved grandma. It's been a slightly sad time in the Swanton family because she did die only last week.
Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that, James.
Well, she lived a really good long life. She was born in 1931, which is when Lugosi's Dracula came out, and she lived all the way to this year, the centenary year of Nosferatu coming out. And you think about lost loved ones at such times, and I've recently dug out pictures of my misspent early youth when, she helped me make this sort of gruesome Dracula puppet, and I'm holding it with an expression of great joy. And even better than that, for like a children's sports day costume competition, she made me this incredibly elaborate Dracula costume. So,
oh wow!
I always credit my grandma for me being a sort of sort of one-man monster show. Other more skilled hands are now making the costumes, but she was there right at the start, and actually, I've said more skilled hands, but what she could do with a sewing machine was extraordinary. And,
oh, wow.
Yes.
That's fantastic. So she was part of your origin story then?
Oh, she really was, and she preached a particularly high doctrine of the Christopher Lee Dracula, because she had seen it in 1958 when it first came out in cinemas. So she was always telling me, you have to see the Christopher Lee Dracula. But the trouble was, as I was growing up, it was never on TV.
Right, yeah.
So the first Hammer Dracula I saw, the first Hammer horror period I saw, was Dracula's Risen from the Grave, which my
Yes.
dad was kind enough to spot in a TV guide and tape for me off ITV or whatever it was on.
Yeah.
And that's a fantastic film. It's so visually rich and has this kind of pulsating, almost hallucinogenic use of the colour red. It's a brilliant introduction to Christopher Lee's Dracula, but not the original. My grandma then saw Dracula Prince of Darkness was on TV, so she recorded me that, and although it starts with the end of Hammer's original Dracula, the destruction of Dracula, which is, for my money, the most exciting climax to any horror film ever, it still wasn't the original. But, very eventually came by the DVD of the original Hammer Dracula, and that was a very special moment to share with her in particular.
What do you think? I'd love to ask your opinion, especially as an actor, James. What do you think is the secret to a good portrayal of Dracula as a character? Kim Newman sort of said last week that he's not sure if we've had a really decent performance on screen of Dracula since maybe Gary Oldman in the early 90s.
It's something I thought about a great deal, mainly because at the same time I was writing my one-man Frankenstein's Creature, nearly 10 years ago now, it was my initial idea to do it as a companion piece to a one-man Dracula.
Oh, wow.
So I've written a whole script for that, and occasionally I dig it out of a drawer and have another go at it. I did so a few years ago because there was a tickling of interest in possibly doing a film of that as well. But I have never got it to quite work to my satisfaction. And I think this is because of the very nature of Dracula as a character. So you look at Frankenstein, it's a romantic novel.
Yeah.
And a romantic monster, you can stand them up and they can talk about their feelings and their thoughts at great length in florid detail.
Yeah.
You compare that with Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is bleak Victorian Gothic. And the thing that makes that novel work so effectively is Dracula is forever, or nearly forever, on the fringes, on the sidelines.
That's right, yeah.
Hidden away in the shadows. There's almost a Dracula-shaped hole in that novel, and that's the cause of all the terror. He for me, Dracula to really work, he has to be portrayed as a man essentially bereft of soul. And what I discovered in trying to turn that into a one-man play is it's almost impossible to stand up in front of people, to talk to an audience, playing a character without a soul for an hour and a half, without constantly coming back to that kind of hollowness as the point of the whole enterprise. I get very impatient of attempts to explain Dracula or to give him a backstory.
Yes.
Because I do feel it misses the point. I understand the dramatist's urge to do so, because that idea of soullessness is so hard to dramatise. But I fundamentally don't want Dracula to be Vlad the Impaler or Judas or whatever other clever angle they found. I don't care for the love story being an element.
Yeah.
So I did actually play Dracula on stage a few years ago, in a play with other people, which I also do occasionally, and would like to do more of, if anyone's listening. And I did get a lot of input in the script there, which was lovely, and we essentially did it in a very faithful to Stoker fashion, as kind of the Woman in Black version of Dracula. So we kept him in the shadows. I was appearing constantly as a kind of silhouette behind gauze, and I'd materialise behind the audience and reel off some Stoker and then vanish again. And only in the last 10, maybe even 5 minutes did I actually materialise fully. So that to me seems the way to do it. Dracula, as in Stoker's novel, has to be dodging the light.
That's really interesting, isn't it? And I think that's true. It's something that that's going to be really interesting to look at, how, because you're right, it'd been so long since I read the book, and I almost forgot how sort of absent Dracula is for most of the book, really. And like you say, he's in the shadows, he's on the periphery, and that makes him scarier, I think. And I think by giving him, I guess, sort of maybe post Bela Lugosi, maybe, but giving him that more leading man status has kind of slowly evolved into giving him more personality, giving him more charm, giving him a sympathetic side and everything else, which can be interesting, but maybe isn't as frightening as, for example, the portrayal of Dracula that we're going to discuss in just a moment, right? And it's very interesting the way that that's changed. Yes,
absolutely.
All right, well, that's a nice segue into the first movie we're going to discuss, I think. So let's get into Nosferatu from 1922. Can you believe, James? 100 years old. Unbelievable.
I can believe it, because this film to me has always seemed at least 200 years old.
Yeah, fair enough.
It's merely catching up to my estimation of its true age.
I love it. So set us up, James, first of all. What's the story of Nosferatu?
A terrible plague has infiltrated the German town of Wisborg. Houses are shuttered up with crosses crudely chalked on the doors. Black coffins line the streets. Swarms of diseased rats have descended on the harbour from a deserted ship. Now, in the midst of all of this chaos stands Nosferatu, the angular medieval monster who serves as the plague's chief carrier. And also the woman who is the only one who knows how to stop him.
Lovely. So tell me, there's so much to talk about, but let me start with the basic question. Tell me a little bit about your history with this film and what you think of it.
Well, again, I have to credit my grandma with indirectly introducing me to this film, because she would always visit charity shops, and if there was a book that was even slightly spooky, she would get hold of it for me. And one of the books she brought back was like a child's guide to Dracula and vampires. I can't remember the title of it, frustratingly, but it did have a really stellar write-up of Nosferatu that essentially said, "See this film, it's definitive," and accompanying it, a picture of Max Schreck standing in that doorway.
Oh, yes.
Shortly before he goes to bite Ellen. So I was desperate to see it, and it did become the second vintage horror film I saw after The Phantom of the Opera. And, yeah, I mean, I say nothing remotely controversial when I state quite flatly, this is the very greatest of all silent horror films.
Yeah.
And I think, interestingly enough, along with that Lon Chaney version of The Phantom of the Opera, it's probably the most watched silent film of any genre in this day and age.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it works fantastically well. It works perfectly brilliantly on two levels. You know, it can be appreciated and forensically studied as an art film, but it's also just a rollicking good horror story.
It's so good, isn't it? I watched this for the first time as a student. I remember enjoying it then at the time, even though it kind of felt a bit like homework. And when I rewatched it, and I do, and you don't get cross with me, James, but I do find sometimes if I have to sit down and watch a film from this era, I do kind of have to slightly get myself in the zone and think, right, come on, pay attention, put your phone away. You know, you've got to, and it does feel a little bit like homework sometimes when I go to a film that's this early and this important in a way, you know, and I kind of think to myself, is it going to be as enjoyable as it is important, right? But
well, I was just trying to give you confidence.
Yes.
I know we're not recording this in the same room, but I wasn't about to throw things at you.
Okay,
because I think what you state is very similar to my experience.
Okay, good.
Silent films can be a chore to watch.
Yes.
And encountering even something as striking as Nosferatu in a less than stellar restoration which is thankfully getting harder to do.
Yeah.
It can really deaden the experience. And, of course, it has to be remembered that the proportion of rubbish being made has always been about similar through cinema history.
Yes.
There are bad silent films. I mean, a lot of them have slipped through the cracks or vanished forever now. But, I mean, thank God Nosferatu is not one of those films. And it does have this really fascinating lack of polish, doesn't it? Which, to me, just kind of adds to its raw power. Even the apparent flaws in it, to me, or what people sometimes pick out as flaws, are a completely vital part of this experience, which is Nosferatu. You know, I don't care that the day for night shots are the most obvious in film history. I don't care that the speeded up motion looks slightly comical to our jaded 21st century eyes.
No.
I don't care that the stop motion is rather crudely done. I don't think it would gain in stature from any of these elements being changed. They're all parts of the whole, and to me, meaningful parts of the whole. And, of course, at the centre of it all, you have Max Schreck as Count Orlok.
Yeah.
Which is just one of those miracles of acting.
Yeah.
You completely believe that here we are watching a real vampire. And not in that slightly cheesy way that Shadow of the Vampire tried to foist on us.
Yes.
We are getting the real thing here, and it's the most powerful portrait of the vampire as ghost in existence, and I think, for my money, the most powerful vampire we've ever had on film.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you. Actually, I just think this is brilliant as well, and I think it is my favourite silent horror film. It is my favourite silent film. I think it's just like wonderful, and it isn't a chore. You know, when I sat down to watch it with all that kind of in mind, prepared for it to feel like homework, I just got swept up in it. I loved it. It's so genuinely creepy, but it's also funny, and it kind of zips along, you know, and I kind of love this kind of stripped back version of Dracula that it presents us with, you know, of the novel that it presents us with, and
yes,
some of the supporting characters are great. The look of it, like you say, the weirdness of the day for night or the stop motion, all of that adds to its weird, nightmarish quality for me, I think, and it all adds to the experience. It's
certainly more than the sum of its parts. I completely agree with you.
I absolutely love it. It is one of my favourite. It's one of my favourite Dracula adaptations by far, I think. Which, you know, I guess we should... why don't we start by talking about that? And I'm sure a lot of people kind of know the backstory to this, but let's begin by talking about this film and its connection with Bram Stoker's Dracula and sort of what subsequently happened to this film. Because it was an adaptation of Dracula, but not an official one.
No, a free adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula,
yes.
as I think they, to put it mildly, rather cheekily called it, and didn't hide. It's there in the opening credits, freely adapted.
Yes.
I mean, it has to be observed. It's incredible we have this film to watch at all. I mean, so many silent films are lost anyway. If it existed, you would doubtless be covering the other significant silent vampire film on this podcast, London After Midnight, with Lon Chaney, with his razor-sharp teeth and bulbous eyes. And although that hailed from the Golden Gates of MGM, we don't have a single print. And we've also lost F.W. Murnau's adaptation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which came out shortly before Nosferatu. The Face of Janus, which starred Conrad Veidt, my favourite, as Jekyll and Hyde. And, you know, that's a case where Robert Louis Stevenson's estate possibly didn't know about the film, certainly didn't sue the makers, but we have still lost every single copy. Now, Nosferatu is different in that Bram Stoker's widow, Florence Stoker, who was formidable when Bram was around and became increasingly formidable as the years went by after his death, she pursued this film with a passion as determined as Van Helsing trying to destroy Dracula. She wanted every single print completely obliterated, destroyed, wiped from the face of the earth. She gave no consideration whatsoever to the film's artistic qualities. She couldn't have been less interested in actually seeing it. It was all financially motivated, it was all mercenary, all very principled. And to be completely fair, that was within her rights.
Yes.
She wanted to sell the rights to Dracula to someone who was interested in dramatising it, and I think rightly saw the existence of a rogue version as being a threat to that.
Absolutely. You can see where she was coming from, can't you? But also, thank God, in a way that she didn't manage to successfully destroy every single print, right?
Thank God, thank God.
And what do you think of the changes made to the novel, and the way it's been adapted for screen? Obviously, I guess for legal reasons, for reasons so they could get away with it, they've changed certain character names and that kind of thing, but they've also kind of pared it down, haven't they? They've sort of removed certain elements, certain characters, and sort of certain details have changed, but I think it works phenomenally well, doesn't it, as a book-to-film adaptation in that way?
It's incredibly judicious in terms of the choices it makes.
Yeah.
And it moves at a very fast clip as well. I think its pacing, actually, is precisely what allows it to play so fast and loose with the source material. It all flicks by so rapidly, really.
Yeah.
The structuring, I think, is very wise. It's... Actually, rewatching it, I found it's amusingly close to the structure of the BBC Netflix Dracula that was to come almost exactly a century later.
Yes.
To me, at least, it feels very much like this film resolves into 3 distinct parts.
Mm-hmm.
You have the Transylvanian castle as the first part, and then the ship feels like the centre of the second part, and then the final part is the invasion of the vampire into Western civilization. Yeah, I mean, it does funny things as well. There are loose ends left hanging in Nosferatu. There's a very enigmatic scene, for example, with Ellen's sister-in-law Ruth, quite near the end of the film, where she's distressed in her bedroom and her candle is blown out by the wind, and we never find out exactly what happens there. It's not clear whether it's just a generalised hysteria. Maybe she's realised she's contracted this dreadful plague in Visborg. It's not clear whether Nosferatu is about to attack her, although that might slightly violate Nosferatu's need to gain permission to enter into a house. It's in there, but it doesn't really ever come to light precisely what's going on. Yeah, I mean, essentially, I think what happens with Nosferatu is it boils down all of the Victorian clutter of the novel to a very romantic essence. And I think this is complemented extremely well by how Nosferatu takes the setting of Dracula. It takes the whole timeline back to the start of the 19th century. Dracula, we have to remember, is a late 19th century novel, and in its day, it was a contemporary novel.
It is, and I love what they've done with some of the characters. Obviously we've got Harker is now Hutter. I guess Mina is now Ellen, right? And we've got and Renfield is Knock, essentially, right?
Everyone's favourite, Mr.
Love Knock. Absolutely love Knock.
The man for whom the expression "beetling eyebrows" may well have been invented.
It's so good.
Eyebrows for days. It's fantastic.
Yeah, just such brilliant faces on all these characters. It just makes it so watchable. I love it. It's so visual. And speaking of, let me just start off by asking you just about the way this film looks, I suppose. So F.W. Murnau's direction here. We've talked a little bit before together, James, about German Expressionism when we covered Caligari. How does this movie kind of, what do you think of, I suppose, just the way this movie looks as, I suppose, another example of German Expressionist horror from this era?
It's a funny thing, really, that the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu always seem to be held up as the twin tentpoles of German Expressionism on film. But when you start to look at them, you very quickly realise that Nosferatu is as distinct in its visual qualities from the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari as the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is distinct from nearly every other expressionist film.
Yes, they're so different, actually, aren't they? Yeah,
the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari revels in its artificiality. Nosferatu revels in its relative naturalism. And you find that most other expressionist films fall somewhere between the two extremes. Has to be observed that, as with Caligari, Nosferatu can be considered an example of a financial limitation being made into an advantage. The budget was by no means high. And we certainly know from later Murnau films, particularly his glorious version of Faust in 1926, he could go full German expressionism when he wanted to.
Yes.
When the resources were there, and the money, of course. But with Nosferatu, the style is in fact much closer to romanticism than expressionism. There are expressionist details that come in and out, notably the vampire shadow, but for the most part, you're plunged headfirst into nature, and in particular, the German romantic painter Caspar David Friedrich has been picked out as a particular influence on Murnau. There was a significant exhibition of Friedrich's paintings when Murnau was still at art school, and if you start to Google some of those paintings, they're very, very close to a lot of the compositions in Nosferatu, especially the beginning in Transylvania, where it's shots of the Czechoslovakian landscape. I was particularly struck, returning to Nosferatu this time as well, how much of the really significant action in the film is literally framed. It's framed most of the time through characters looking through windows.
Yes, that's true.
Some of the time it's framed by doorways, but the windows are really obsessively implemented. And, you can argue that by default, whenever you put anything in front of a camera, you are putting a frame around it. But by having a frame within the frame, you really do feel at times with Nosferatu that you are beholding a series of paintings in an art gallery. I mean, the naturalism has great dividends as well. It gives the whole film this really hard-edged beauty.
Yeah.
And also a kind of feeling of authenticity. And I really feel that both of those factors deepen the film's impact as horror.
Agreed, yeah.
So you have the contrast of this beautiful, gorgeous natural landscape versus hideousness of the vampire. And, of course, no film has a more hideous vampire than this film. And equally, there's this really unsettling verisimilitude when I certainly cannot always tell when we're looking at a set versus when we're looking at a real location.
Yeah.
So for years and years and years, I just blithely assumed that whenever we're inside the castle, we are in fact inside a real castle. I don't believe that's actually the case. But it's, again, framed so well, and it's set up so beautifully that you really buy it as being in the castle of Count Orlok. By comparison, if you look at the Universal Dracula, it's wonderful, but it's clearly artificial.
Yes.
With Nosferatu, there's always that creepy, insinuating feeling of a realism.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I love that about it as well. Exactly as you said, I think it adds to the horror. This feeling like, I mean, I thought until now that it was all shot on location. We're in those courtyards, we're in those streets, we're in those kind of big, houses, and all those amazing vistas and landscapes, and it is beautiful. And then this creature kind of invading these spaces, right? Yeah. And there is something. You're right. The framing in windows as people look out. There's a lot of kind of point of view shots and reverse kind of point of view shots and all this kind of thing, and all of that kind of just makes it a lot easier to watch than a film like Caligari, I think, because it does feel like it's sort of it's a little bit more modern in the language of the filmmaking, actually, even though it's German expressionism. Actually, even easier than the next film we're going to talk about, Vampyr, which feels so experimental in its form that you kind of go, hang on, where are we now? And what and this movie isn't like that at all. You can, in a way, almost kind of switch your brain off and just watch it for what it is, which I think is amazing for a film that's 100 years old.
Oh, you can make it as simple or as complicated as you like.
Yeah.
It's the beauty of Nosferatu.
Yeah, but then also there are those incredible, I guess that the more expressionist shots of Nosferatu, the really iconic moments of Nosferatu's shadow creeping up the stairs, or the shadow of the hand kind of clutching the chest of Ellen when she's in bed and all of that. And I just love the way that all of that looks and the way that story is told visually with moments like that as well.
Well, it's fascinating that you mentioned Nosferatu's shadow particularly, because this really leaped out at me watching it this time. Because I think I identified that as an obvious expressionist element of the film.
Yes.
Just now. And although I do agree with that to some extent, mainly because I said it, the way shadows are used in relation to the vampire, they sort of go beyond stylisation. In fact, there's this incredibly sinister suggestion that he's not casting a shadow. He has, in fact, become the shadow.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Because when we get to the end of the film, and we see that shot of him reaching towards Ellen's door, he's not reaching towards the shadow of the door. The shadow is actually opening the door.
That's right, yes.
And equally, when the shadow clutches at her heart, she recoils, as though he has actually squeezed hold of her heart in some way.
He's more ethereal and ghostly almost, isn't he?
Indeed,
Yeah.
it's the vampire as ghost all over again. And, of course, we know from other moments of the film that he can turn transparent, seemingly at will.
Yes.
And there's also this really creepy thing where, although he lays waste to the town of Visborg, he's seen. He's actually physically seen by so few characters in the film.
Yes.
So he's seen by Hutter, obviously, when he goes to the castle. He's subsequently seen by 3 sailors on the ship, all of whom die and therefore cannot tell the tale.
Yeah.
The only other person who sees him in the film is Ellen, and she has to die as well. Nock is obviously Count Orlok's biggest fan. He never meets him.
No, they don't have a scene together, do they?
No,
that's really interesting, yeah.
I mean, I think they'd melt the camera lens, the amount of grotesque energy if they were to meet. Perhaps a very good reason for that. But
Yes.
It's nonetheless very odd.
Yeah, I love that. But there is this other feeling, isn't there, that these characters have this kind of ethereal psychic connection with him. Nock does and Ellen does as well, right? And I think that all of that, and it's just such a beautifully, it's such a perfect example of what you get from a novel compared to what you can get with a film, because in some ways this is the purest kind of visual example, I suppose, of this story, because it's the silent film as opposed to some of the big examples we get post this that are more adapted from the stage play or whatever. This is that story stripped back and told entirely in visuals, and it's just so pure, but it works so well. It's wonderful.
And has horror cinema ever had a greater visual than Max Schreck playing Count Orlok?
Oh, well, which leads me nicely onto my next question for you, James. What do you make of that stunning performance?
I mean, I think it's really beyond analysis to me.
Yeah.
There's just no actor who can reach what he's doing in that role. I suppose a lot of it's to do with the neat coincidence of the actor and the part and the time and all of that kind of thing. But, you look at William Dafoe in Shadow of the Vampire, and he's doing wonderful things, but he's in no way replicating anything close to Max Schreck.
No.
I really take issue with this when people sing the praises of Shadow of the Vampire, saying, oh, they're basically twins. No, they're not doing the same thing at all. And equally, Klaus Kinski in the very wonderful Werner Herzog Nosferatu, he's doing something else again.
Yes.
I mean, I know I certainly use Max Schreck as a movement reference all the time. I think I've looked at Nosferatu for all 3 of the films I've been doing this year for various different things. But what's really remarkable about Max Schreck's Count Orlok is its simplicity.
Yes.
He has all that grotesquerie where makeup is concerned.
Yeah.
The long talons and the rat-like teeth and all the rest of it. And he does almost nothing that you can visually assess, visually read on screen. It's a very, very subtle performance. And I'm always glad of anything that once again proves that subtlety was very, very possible within the silent film. I mean, he's genuinely terrifying, of course.
Yeah.
I think never more so than in that shot in the castle where midnight has come and Hutter opens his bedroom door and you are shown the castle hallway and he's there in long shot stood by the fireplace.
Yes.
Then the camera fades a bit closer and he's just stood there. He's just stood there.
Yes.
And interestingly enough, that's the very first moment in the film where we see his bald head. And there's something obscene about the bald head in Nosferatu. Mm-hmm. It's very carefully covered with this strange cloth cap up to that point. But then we see him without it, and it feels violating. It's almost, it's almost like nudity in a way. There's something obscene about seeing Nosferatu's domed head. And we only ever really see Nosferatu attack right at the end of the film, when he finally puts the bite on Ellen. We've had a fleeting moment where he's gone for Thomas's hand after Thomas has cut himself in the castle. But just that shot of him prone on Ellen's neck, completely unmoving. Again, the lack of movement is really the hallmark of Schreck's terrifying performance. Not particularly made prominent in the frame either. He's down there in the left-hand bottommost corner. That's what makes him so frightening, I think. It does induce in me a true shiver of revulsion. Yeah. There's nothing obviously graphic about it, but it feels to me so much more visceral than the vast majority of vampire attacks in film. Yeah. And he's also very funny in places, which I love. Yes. And it's clearly a deliberate funniness. The moment I always wait for and really, really enjoy is a subtle detail, but I love it every time. It comes just after Count Orlok has signed the contract. He's agreed to buy the lovely deserted old house opposite Thomas's. And he signs, and then he gestures to the papers and looks at Thomas and says, "Come on, clear up your rubbish." Yeah. And Thomas does, and Count Orlok just keeps his gaze on him, and he sort of slightly puckers his mouth as though to say, "Didn't do that very willingly, did you?" and then Hutter again locks eyes with him, and he just kind of opens his mouth slightly as though, oh, sorry.
He gets a bit sassy there, a
little bit. There's this spry, impish humour that suffuses all of Max Schreck's performance, and as so often, I just feel humour deployed in that sort of uncanny way. It only serves to heighten the horror.
Yes.
It in no way detracts. You feel the confidence of the actor in the character and the situation, but he can play about a bit. And it just makes it all the more terrifying to me.
Yeah, I love the performance as well, and you're absolutely right. Everything you said, it's not just the horrific makeup and costume, which is so scary in itself, but it's the stillness and the slow movement, and of course the way he's framed a lot of the time as well. Like you say, those. And funnily enough, I think I spoke to Sam Ashurst about this, about your performance in Frankenstein's Creature, actually, about a certain shot where you're very far away from the camera, sort of looking directly at us, and then sort of and it's a moment where you go quiet and then you kind of slowly move towards the camera, and that I remember telling Sam I found one of the most chilling moments. And there's something about kind of people or monsters far away or quite small in the frame, or on the side,
I have this as well, and I think it's why that moment in Nosferatu I mentioned leapt out at me so strongly. The very first time I viewed this film 20 years ago, that absolutely made my blood run cold.
Yes, yeah.
Equally, I remember as a child, and again, this is probably my grandma's legacy, if I ever came by a book with ghost photographs in, those would always be the photographs that frighten me the most.
Yes!
Where the apparition is far away. I think there's a psychological thing here. I think there's a lightning-fast process that goes on in the brain where you're assessing your ability to escape the source of the threat.
Aha, yes.
And if it's quite far away, I always think, especially if it's down a corridor or something, I always think, oh my God, this is going to be agony running away from this, knowing it's getting closer for such a long time.
That's right, that's right. It's the fear that it's going to get closer, isn't it? And there's that wonderful, again, you talked about how many sort of window shots there are. There's that amazing moment towards the end as well, before he comes for Ellen, where she looks at him and he's in his window, and he slowly kind of turns away and moves away because he's then coming for her. And again, it's like, he's kind of quite small and quite shadowed. You barely sort of see him really, but you just sort of see him start to turn away from the window as if he's coming now, kind of thing. And it's those are the moments that I just love, and they hold up so well, because so many horror movies these days have those exact kind of moments, and it's perfect. Yeah,
it's wonderful as well how they commit to Nosferatu glaring at Ellen from that window earlier on in the film as well, because there's a long shot of that deserted house, and I think this was almost impossible to see for years and years and years because we had such terrible prints of Nosferatu. But you can make out Max Schreck's Count Orlok in that same position, in that same window, staring obsessively across the street at the Hutter household.
Yes.
But nothing is made of it. Again, it's small in the frame.
It's great.
And I suppose, just as an add-on to all of this lovely discussion about the threat of a monster seen from far away, is the eye contact.
Yes.
One of the liberties of that I was able to take in Frankenstein's Creature, with it being a one-man film, was I could lock eyes with the camera.
Yeah.
I could address the camera directly, and that's certainly what we were doing in that moment you talk about. There are a few moments in Nosferatu where Max Schreck seems to be staring through the camera and at the audience. Mm-hmm. Particularly right at the end, when he's heard the crow of the cock. He slowly rears up from Ellen's neck. But he doesn't immediately look out of the window to confirm the coming of the dawn. He stares directly through the screen at us.
Yeah.
And it's horrifying. Especially given Max Schreck never blinks in the film.
Ah, there you go.
It's exactly the same as Anthony Hopkins in The Silence of the Lambs. There is not a single shot where Max Schreck is seen blinking.
Oh, and how many on-screen monsters or horror villains have we seen try and do something like that, right? I mean, I think it's impossible to overstate just how important Max Schreck's performance is as the quintessential, possibly most influential monster performance of all time, right? It's probably up there with Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster in terms of, you know, actors and other monsters just innately will mimic this performance, this look, the juddery movements, the slowness, the stillness, the wide eyes.
I think virtually any monster with a pair of hands will be doing something that could be likened to Nosferatu at some point.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It casts a very, very long shadow.
Yeah, quite literally,
I'm pleased that even in things like What We Do in the Shadows, which of course is a Nosferatu lookalike.
Yes.
Is it Peter?
Yes.
Peter,
wakey. Yeah.
I mean, even there, he is genuinely terrifying.
He is.
That's the source of the comedy.
Yeah.
I'm really glad that they were able to maintain that. And, you know, of course, Reggie Naldo in Salem's Lot as Mr. Barlow.
Yes.
Again,
absolutely
terrifying. I mean, Klaus Kinski in Werner Herzog's Nosferatu, he doesn't have the visceral terror of Max Schreck, but even so, there are moments in that film, particularly his first attack on Hutter in the castle, which are unbelievably scary.
Yeah.
There's something in Nosferatu as a visual arrangement which is phenomenally frightening. I don't know if it's bound up in evolution, where we regard pointed creatures as being threatening to us.
That's interesting.
But, you know, as I say, beyond analysis.
It is. It's unconscious. It's subconscious almost how it works on us.
It just works.
It just works. And again, how funny, how different to, you know, I think these days probably most people would think of Dracula on screen as being a kind of sexy, suave, alluring figure, right? And there's nothing sexy or attractive about this portrayal of Dracula.
No, absolutely not. Although there is a rich school of Freudian-tinged criticism. I imagine Mary Wilde will have a field day, which is tried to dub Nosferatu a sort of walking penis.
Right.
I mean, you can kind of see why when he springs up in the hold of the ship.
Yes, oh my God.
Erect, as it were.
Very much so, yeah. Oh, that is all really interesting, isn't it? And also, there is, I suppose, I don't know, whether it's a sexual connection or attraction, there is some kind of attraction between, you know, Count Orlok and Ellen, right? This moment when she's looking at him and then he comes over to her bedroom at night. You know, what do you make of that, of the relationship between Ellen and Orlok?
I suppose you could term it sexual without in any way being sexy.
Yes.
Because it is about bodily possession to some extent. But I don't think I'd go any further than that.
Yeah.
Ellen in general is a fascinatingly portrayed character. And right from the off, I think it's one of those things that's often been picked out as a deficiency in the film. I think wrongly, which is how the marriage of the Hutters is presented, especially at the start. This bizarre set of situations you get where you have Thomas Hutter sort of acting like this big overgrown child bumbling about, and she's just pallid and drawn, and already seems to be in the thrall of the vampire in some way.
Yeah,
but I think that's very deliberate.
She's quite sort of statuesque throughout, isn't she? She doesn't really do much compared to how much he kind of scuttles about.
Yeah. I mean, when you say statuesque, that makes me think of icons, which makes me think of sort of Catholic religion, and she's kind of presented in those terms. She's a virgin, essentially.
Yeah.
He's an overgrown child. Mm-hmm. She's a virgin, and really, to be honest, the undercurrent in the scenes of their marriage, which I suppose you could view as the filmmaker's ham-fisted attempt to portray an idyllic union. I think what's really going on is they're portraying the union as deeply troubled and absolutely sexless. Mm-hmm. You know, we have those portents right from the off. I mean, again, going back to the window thing, our first view of Ellen is Hutter looking through his window and seeing her in her own window playing with the cat. And, of course, later on, she will open her window in order to invite Nosferatu into her bedroom and seal her fate. Yeah. So, I mean, that's a bit of a downer, despite how lovely the cat is, on which to open our view of their relationship.
Yes.
And then, you know, he goes and gets her flowers, and she's absolutely appalled, saying, "Why have you killed them, the beautiful flowers?"
Oh, yeah, that's really funny.
That feels
really funny.
It is, but again, it feels to me just a symbol.
Yeah.
Seems to me to hint at the troubled sexuality or non-sexuality that's in the Hutter's marriage.
Yes.
I mean, even right at the end of the film, it's still there. You could certainly argue from her reading the Book of the Vampires and reading that only a sinless maiden giving herself to the vampire suggests that the marriage is completely unconsummated.
Yes, definitely.
There certainly isn't a child on the scene.
Yeah.
That doesn't give us any definitive proof, but it's certainly a hint. And, you know, when Hutter goes to her and he's distraught at her death at the end, and he sprawls himself on the bed, it's nearly the last shot of the film, he's still got 1 foot on the floor.
Yes. Yeah.
So, yeah, I'm not suggesting a union with Max Schreck's Count Orlok is necessarily an answer to marital troubles, but it does come closer to being a to filling that sexual place. Although, as I say, without being in any way sexy.
Yes, exactly that. And while we're on the characters, let me ask you about Knock, because that is another fantastic performance in this. What do you make of the character of Knock?
Oh, he's a romp, isn't he? He's a riot. In many ways, the film's clearest expressionist element. You know, it's a very Werner Krauss's Caligari performance, isn't it?
Yes.
Emil Jannings as Mephistopheles in Faust, or Rudolf Klein-Roeg as Rotwang in Metropolis, wielding his metal arm. He's Max Schreck is grotesque.
Yes.
He's the embodiment of grotesquerie, and therefore he has to do nothing in order to be unashamedly grotesque. Alexander Granich, playing Knock, he's acting up the grotesque, and he's acting up an absolute storm.
Yes.
It's very, very entertaining. I think too much for some people, but I think having Knock as like the rogue element, the sort of rampaging id, as compared to the relative containment of Nosferatu, I think it's very, very effective.
I do as well. It works so well. It's a great performance. Very funny as well. It's a funny and creepy performance at the same time, isn't it? Let me ask you about that sort of middle to late section of the film, from when the Demeter, or not the Demeter, but from when the ship arrives with Nosferatu. That tremendous section where Nosferatu picks off each one of the crew of the ship one by one. There's some really beautiful, creepy imagery there as he sort of kills them all. And then this arrival into Germany, and that imagery, you know, coffins being carried through the streets. There's this air of death, you know, plague, rats. And, you know, people have talked a lot about the kind of the context, the subtext here. Obviously, we're in early 1920s Germany, right? Post-World War I Germany, but pre-Nazi Germany. But all of that was just around the corner, wasn't it? And I wondered what you make of some of this imagery, the imagery of death, post-war, also post-Spanish flu, right? This idea that Germany itself was haunted by the kind of spectre of death at this point in history.
Certainly when they were publicising the film at its premiere, the filmmakers spoke in the publicity about the lingering after effects of the war as being like a psychic vampire. Their exact words that drained the youth of the nation. But, for me, certainly the Spanish flu pandemic seems to me a much bigger influence. It killed more people than were killed in the entirety of the First World War. And it's still on record as the biggest pandemic in history after the Black Death.
Yes.
And it's that kind of more medieval Black Death that Nosferatu seems to appropriate and borrow from. And having well, I really want to say just come through a pandemic ourselves, but really still being in the midst of the pandemic ourselves in some form or other, we can really appreciate a lot of the details in Nosferatu in a way that perhaps wasn't as easy to pre-pandemic. I mean, you have the self-isolation situation of all these houses which have been shuttered up. And you have the public announcements made by that man with the drum about the pandemic, telling people to stay at home and save lives. And you have incredibly medieval-feeling details like the coffins being brought through the streets. I mean, obviously we didn't see in our streets during the pandemic much in the way of physical proofs of death, but this is a thought that occurred to me very early on in coronavirus. I thought if you could actually see something like that, maybe all of the skeptics would take this rather more seriously. It's a very sobering physical reminder of death, isn't it, that we're largely sheltered from in the 21st century, even having gone through a pandemic ourselves now. Especially interesting, I think, is how the plague in Nosferatu, rather like our pandemic, leads to a sort of public hysteria and a scapegoating of a totally unrelated figure in the person of Knock.
Yes.
There are these scenes near the end where he's being chased around the town.
Yes.
Now, we of course know that he is responsible for bringing Nosferatu over to Visborg. There's no way the townspeople can know that.
Yeah.
And I believe an intertitle identifies him as essentially a scapegoat. And of course you think there's no direct equivalence of any kind, but, you think back to the first year of the pandemic when the riots surrounding Black Lives Matter happened.
Yeah.
And you think, plague times, they do kind of work as a pressure cooker for other problems in society. And then you then have these outbursts of rage and confusion, and it's very, very interesting, Nosferatu. And apart from all of that, Nosferatu was made a few years after the Spanish flu pandemic had wound down.
Yeah.
So it's technically a post-pandemic horror film.
Yeah.
We're about due our own by now.
Yes.
We've had horror films whilst the pandemic has been going on.
Yes.
Like Host. And we've had Dashcam as well, which was a pulling out of a pandemic horror film. I think we are going to almost certainly see horror films which are, clearly dealing with the same territory as Nosferatu, the post-pandemic world. And it would be good to see them dealing with it as obliquely as Nosferatu does.
Yeah.
Possibly if this mythical Robert Eggers version of Nosferatu ever comes to the light, possibly that will be our post-pandemic horror.
Oh, God, there's something kind of chilling about it, isn't there? Like, 100 years ago, and people were dealing with global pandemics and wars with Eastern Europe. Thank God we've come so far that none of that happens anymore. Another thing I should ask you about is there are readings of Nosferatu, of Count Orlok, as in the way he looks, as resembling the kind of sort of racist, stereotypical view of an Eastern European Jewish person at that time, right? That kind of Nazi propaganda, obviously this was pre-Nazis, but that kind of anti-Semitic propaganda of the Jewish person. A lot of people have read into the look of Count Orlok as kind of reminiscent of that.
Yeah, I really don't think it was deliberate, but that in no way means it isn't an element in the mix.
Yeah.
I don't think you can ever completely rule these things out. I know yesterday, at your prompting, Mike, I did.
Yes.
What vintage film fans so often do with German films that come between the wars, where you do a sort of panicked Google search of all the personnel thinking, oh God, which of them became Nazis? So often you'll encounter a gap or an anomaly in the filmography of someone you quite admired, and you'll be like, oh, that's interesting. What were they doing during the war? Oh no! And it's like Pandora's box being opened.
Yes.
And there is that interesting trend where a lot of the most overtly grotesque actors in German silent cinema did become the biggest fascists. Particularly Werner Krauss of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
Yeah. And
Emil Jannings, who I mentioned as Mephistopheles in Murnau's Faust. Mm-hmm. There don't seem to have been too many people involved in Nosferatu who did become overtly fascist. I think the only one I could really pin down was the cinematographer, Fritz Arno Wagner. Oh Christ, he's even called Wagner. Who did end up making films for the Ministry of Propaganda during World War II.
Right.
I don't know with how much enthusiasm he did that. You hope little to none, but there we are. It is a fact.
Yeah.
I'm sort of happy and sad to report that both F.W. Murnau and Max Schreck were dead before World War II happened. And funnily enough, if we are talking about anti-Semitic portrayals, I think the most anti-Semitic portrayal in the film, if we are going to go down that route, is probably Alexander Granich as Nock.
Yes.
Because he has all the grotesquerie of Orlok, but he also has the money fixation. He's a very kind of goblin-like individual. And, he's trying to bribe Hutter into going to Transylvania, saying, oh, you could earn a lot of money. Now, happily, Alexander Granich did a Conrad Veidt. He went over to Hollywood before the war and ended up playing Nazis in order to demonise them in films of the 1940s.
Yes.
So it's never clean and it's never simple picking these things apart, but it's an interesting element, and yeah, it is undeniably somewhere in the brew.
Yeah, agreed. Finally then, I want to ask you just about some of those beautifully kind of iconic shots towards the end. I suppose that, probably the images that most people will know of, even if they haven't seen the film, of Nosferatu creeping up the stairs and attacking Ellen in her bed, and then of course him being defeated by the sunlight and everything. Yeah. But what do you think of those kind of final moments of Nosferatu?
I definitely agree it's iconic. I will add in a curveball. Are we absolutely sure he's been defeated?
Ooh.
It's so interesting in general, Nosferatu, because religion seems to be nearly totally absent from this telling of the Dracula story.
Yes.
You have a few nuns who turn up in the hospital nursing Hutter, but they're very much on the fringes. And you have a few crosses. You have the crosses being chalked on the doors of the plague houses, and you have a few, what I think are sailors' graves on the beach where Ellen longs for either Hutter or Orlok to come to her. But that's really it, as far as any Christian element in this film is concerned. But, as I think I said earlier, the brilliance of his adaptation is it translates the detail of Stoker's novel into an essence. So what we have with Ellen at the end is the essence of the Christian religion. It's a sacrifice, a human sacrifice, that leads to a redemption. So, that to me feels far more spiritual than what so many Dracula films do, where, the cross is just used in a tokenistic way. It's like, oh, Dracula's here, let's get out the cross, oh, he's gone now. There's not really any clear, deep, meaningful Christianity in that kind of association, to me at least.
Yeah, that's true.
To the point where Universal, having made Dracula made the next year The Mummy was almost a semi-remake, and they just swapped out the cross for a little figure of Isis, which does the same number on The Mummy. That's how meaningless and how devoid of Christian significance the cross was in the Universal universe. So I believe as a result of that, we already have to take the climax on very symbolic, very mythic terms. And this is why I question whether the vampire is defeated. Because Count Orlok starts as an individual in the film, Count Orlok, but he's sort of metamorphosed over the narrative into something much more diffuse. He is the plague. He is not Count Orlok the individual. He is Nosferatu, this ghoulish supernatural phenomenon. And therefore I do ask that question, is he even defeated? Because people do harp on, and I think rightly in some respects, about this being the first ever film where the vampire is destroyed by the rays of the sun.
Yes.
But it feels to me so much more ritualistic than a destruction. It feels like a symbolic moment. I mean, certainly compared to the Universal Dracula films, in those, I feel I'm watching a very clever special effect where Dracula will turn into this sort of laboratory clean skeleton, and it's beautifully done.
Yes.
But it feels like watching a magic trick. With the Hammer Draculas, it feels incredibly grisly, and it does feel like a true destruction as Christopher Lee claws the flesh from his face and dissolves into dust and becomes skeletal and all of that kind of thing. Nosferatu, he does what he's done at two earlier points in the film where he becomes transparent. Is he vanishing in the sense of having been destroyed, or is he vanishing because he can vanish and he acknowledges that I am the embodiment of evil. I must go because this gesture has been made. But because I am evil, I cannot be completely destroyed. I will return. It's so interesting to me. Just the ambiguity of the ending.
I love that. Yeah, I never really thought of it in that way, but you're absolutely right. And I guess because of what it's responsible for, like you say, it's basically, like you say, the first film to have a vampire seemingly be defeated by sunlight that we've now seen over and over
But as
again.
we know, of course, from the Hammer Dracula films in particular, there's never an end to Dracula.
That's very true.
In any of his forms. He can always be resurrected.
Oh my God, well there you go. What a film. I guess I want to finish, James, by just asking you, this film is 100 years old. That is, I just find incredible, right? It's 100 years old. How does it hold up for you watching it right now in 2022?
I think it's become stronger than ever in many respects.
Yeah.
It's one of those rare cases where a layer of age and decay really just help to strengthen a film's power, I think. It has itself become equivalent to that book of the vampires you find within the film.
Yeah.
It feels very, very credible, very believable as this ancient primary source for this demonic evil.
Yeah, I completely agree. And there's something, there is something kind of magic about it in a strange way, I think, watching it. And while it does, like you say, it looks like it could be hundreds of years old in some regard, it also plays really well, I think, to modern eyes, just as a piece of filmmaking as well. The pacing's good, the storytelling's good, the visuals are amazing. The editing's good, all of that.
It was a very canny decision on the part of the filmmakers to deviate from the cluttered Victorian Gothic and go back to that sort of German romantic thing, because it gives it that timelessness.
It does.
Very, very effective.
Hello, everybody. Just before we get into the second half of this week's episode, I want to take a moment to thank this week's sponsor. That's friend of the pod and Patreon subscriber, Rebecca McCallum. Now, Rebecca is a very long-time friend of this podcast. In fact, she's been involved in many of the big projects that we've had here on the Evolution of Horror. Over the last couple of years on Patreon, we ran these big polls where we counted down the top 50 scariest moments or greatest horror films as voted for by hundreds and hundreds of Patreon subscribers subscribers. Rebecca was absolutely instrumental in helping me to collate all of those results and get everything together. She has been just a superhero in helping me with various bits and pieces. But Rebecca is also a cinephile and academic and writer herself. She writes for Rue Morgue, for Dread Central, Grimm Magazine, and she's also the assistant editor of Ghouls Magazine. And she now, as of this month, has a brand new pocketbook out. The pocketbook is called Mums and Sons, an examination of the child-parent relationship, using 3 stages of life reflected in The Babadook, childhood, Hereditary, teenage years, and finally Psycho for adulthood. This academic pocketbook highlights both the differences and similarities of the mother-son dynamic. The work is split into 8 chapters that each seek to shine a light on a series of themes, including family trauma, the damaging nature of secrets, notions of doubling and duality, and the ultimate taboo, the horror of motherhood. The pocketbook is available in a slickly designed format with artwork from Ken Wayne, and is available for order from Plastic Brain Press. And I will link to where you can order yourself a copy in the show notes. So one more time, a huge thank you to this week's sponsor. That's patron and long-term friend of the pod, Rebecca McCallum. And if you want to be an official Evolution of Horror sponsor and get your own little dedicated segment in an episode just like Rebecca, then you simply need to sign up to our Patreon at a $20 per month level. Patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. That's Patreon.com/Evolution of Horror.
Mr. Hammond, I think we're back in business.
That little clip there was from, well, is it a horror film? I'm going to call it a horror film. That was, of course, one of the most famous and beloved movies of all time. A perfect film. It's Jurassic Park from 1993, and that is a little hint of what we've got going on over on Patreon this week, because I'm very excited to announce that over the next few weeks, we're going to be running an exclusive Patreon mini-series for $10 donors in which we take a look back at the entire Jurassic Park franchise. Episode 1 dropped this week, in which me and friend of the pod Gav Murphy discussed the original Jurassic Park in spoilerific detail. Then next week we're going to be covering Jurassic Park 2 and 3. Then after that we're going to be covering Jurassic World and Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom. And then of course the final episode of the mini season will coincide with the UK release of Jurassic World Dominion, which is out in cinemas mid-June. So I'm really excited. It's the perfect time to rewatch these classic monster movies and reassess them before the new movie. So if you want to listen to this exclusive new mini-season and a whole bunch of other exclusive mini-seasons, then you simply need to sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/Evolution of Horror. Signing up at a $10 level will get you weekly new episodes and a whole back catalogue of mini-seasons and various other bonus treats from the last few years. We're talking hundreds of extra episodes. And everybody who signs up, no matter what tier you sign up to, will get a very special shout out on the main podcast as a thank you. Speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the month of February a little shout out. So a big thank you to Rich Zerbian, Wallace EC, Jan Ruback, Cole Brayfield, Kim French, Chris R, Mirrorin, John Garley, Joel Winder, Lisa Macronicholas, Dave Morrow, Mark Swanson, Kate Peltier, Jess Thomas, Kurt Matzenbacher, Drew, Robin Taylor, Spencer Haley, Philip Teat, Susan Fidian, Christopher C. Legatti, Molly Dyson, Darren Taylor, Andrew Norman, Andrew Jones, Kevin Guthrie, David Cross, Graham Elliott, Millie Clements, Brad M, Andrew Randack, Nicole Edgar, Jacob Farnsworth, Jay Glass, Samuel Charles Inez, Zachary Reynolds, Steve Power, Erin, Mitchell Ten Bowden, Louise Lachlan, Dominic Nicholson, Todd Atticus, Joel Coltrup, Marcus Pagrialolo, Clarice Costa, Tech Butterfly, Zach McIntyre, Sophie Duong, Jesse, Nick Roberts, Matthew Wright, and Matthew Bainbridge. A huge thank you to all of those kind, lovely, generous people for signing up to their bonus content on Patreon. And one more time, if you want to join them and get regular bonus episodes and other special treats, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. All right, in just a moment, we're going to get into the second half of this week's episode, in which James Swanton and I discuss the weird and wonderful nightmarish masterpiece that is Carl Theodor Dreyer's Vampyr. And just a quick announcement to say that if you've never seen Vampyr, or if you have, but you've never seen it on the big screen and you're within reach of London, get yourself down to the Genesis Cinema in London. That is, of course, our official cinema partner, host of the monthly Evolution of Horror Presents screenings, but they are going to be screening a 90th anniversary restoration of this brilliant movie on the big screen on Monday the 6th of June at 6:45 p.m. It is a stunning film, and it will be so much more stunning to see at the Genesis on the big screen with an audience. So I would highly recommend you grab yourself a ticket. Not only that, we are also running a little competition, and we're going to be giving away 2 free tickets to that very special screening. So all you've got to do to enter is follow us on Twitter and retweet our Twitter post about the film, quoting the name of your favourite vampire movie. Okay, that's all you need to do to enter, and the winner will be selected at random to win a pair of tickets for this very special screening. So we'll list the details to that in the show notes, but make sure you're following us and the Genesis Cinema on Twitter. And if you can, come along to that special 90th anniversary screening of Vampyr on the 6th of June. Speaking of, let's get into our deep dive discussion of this incredible movie. It's Carl Theodor Dreyer's Vampyr from 1932.
Mr. Gray is a man in search of his own story. He's even in search of his own name, arguably. It might be Alan, it might be David. Really depends on which version of Vampyr you encounter. We don't know.
Yes.
So as he roams through the white mists that surround an isolated French village, he'll variously encounter a grim ferryman, a blind man in the upstairs room, his own body enclosed in his own coffin with its own viewing window, and skull after skull after skull after skull. He'll also enter a chateau of frightened victims to a soldier with a wandering shadow, a doctor who delights in blood transfusions, and an elderly vampire called Marguerite Chopin.
Indeed. Where to start with this film? I want to start by asking you a bit about your thoughts on it and your history with it then, James. Do you remember when you first came to this movie?
I remember catching this on TV when I was first getting into vintage horror. It might have been the Horror Channel or something in its early days, which did show much older fare. And I simply didn't get it. Yeah. I didn't get it at all. I have to add that at that point in time, all we had of Vampyr was a truly appalling print, which had subtitles in Gothic type on sort of bold black blocks which blotted out about half of the image whenever they appeared. So I could tease out certain moments of great power, particularly the dance of the shadows and the subjective journey in the coffin, but the whole thing just didn't really transmit for me.
Yeah.
Now, happily, a few years later, I got a terrible fever which left me bedridden, much like the victim of a vampire in this film, actually. And I had, by that time, acquired Eureka's lovely restoration of Vampyr on DVD. I put it on, and I swear down, I watched it 3 times in a day.
Right, well, that's really interesting.
It was absolutely in tune with my feverish state of not knowing quite what was going on, where I was, how anything was going to turn out. I loved it then. I still love it now. It's a very rare viewing experience for me, where I really never tire of watching this film. I've certainly got no desire to solve it. I don't think you can solve it.
No.
But I don't feel that would enhance my enjoyment. I just want to escape into that strange, dreamy netherworld every so often.
I agree, and it's definitely one of those films that you do kind of have to watch twice over or 3 times over, I think. I think I had the same thing as you, watched it first time, don't really entirely get it, and I think I was clasping for some sort of coherent narrative, I suppose.
Yes.
And then watching it a second time, I sort of fell in love with it because you can just kind of bathe in it almost and enjoy it for what it is, which is this incredibly dreamlike. I mean, like Fever. A fever is perfect. It's a fever dream of a film, I think, in many ways.
Yes. I really do think the key thing to grasp when approaching this film for the first time is that the plot, such as there is a plot, is actually remarkably simple.
Yes,
it just happens to be told in the most convoluted, complicated, and, as you say, feverish way. It's the polar opposite to The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which obviously we've discussed before, which seems on the surface to be a simple narrative, which opens out into this fiendish puzzle box of plotting.
Yeah.
Vampyr is quite simple as far as the narrative goes. It's just that the more you peer at it, the more the narrative invites enormous unanswerable questions, such as, what is reality in this universe? Is anything reality? Is this objective? Is this subjective? Are we in a dream? Is everyone dead?
Right.
Are some people dead and others living?
Yes. And so is the plot on the face of it? I mean, I know this is pointless, me trying to kind of, but is the plot on the face of it basically man travels to inn, a vampire is there, attacks people in the inn, attacks him, and then he bests the vampire and the vampire or her and the vampire's kind of minions at the end, and he escapes? I mean, is that basically the plot of this film?
That's basically the plot.
Yeah,
that is basically it. Although I believe you may be crediting the protagonist with doing more than he actually does.
He just wanders.
In your synopsis.
He just wanders
about.
Really
does.
Yeah.
He really does. He does so little of substance. I was so struck by that, returning to the film this time. All of the really significant moments in the narrative, he's either on the sidelines or doing bugger all, frankly.
Yeah.
So the destruction of the vampire. Actually, I have to add in Gray's defence. If you look at the deleted scenes culled from I believe the French dialogue version of the film, there are additional shots where he's the one hammering the stake into the vampire at the end.
Right, that's interesting.
But in the film, in the films, it plays out in the German version, which is the one that's been restored and is now widely available. Yeah. That shot doesn't exist. It was deemed too violent. So even at the vampire's destruction, you don't get a sense of Gray doing anything at all. He gives a blood transfusion to try and help an ailing victim of a vampire, and I don't think the blood actually gets to her because the doctor runs off with it.
Very, very watchable, isn't he? Even though he does very little, I find. He's quite striking.
Weirdly watchable, and I think we have to acknowledge that he is the reason the film was made. The actor Julian West, the Baron de Gunsberg, he financed the production, so we have a lot to thank him for. And given he insisted on starring in it, Carl Dreyer, who directed, he plays this very stiff, potentially very wooden non-actor to the best possible advantage.
Very handsome. I think that helps too, right? I mean, he's very watchable in that regard. Very handsome, very well dressed, but doesn't do much.
Yes, yeah. Well, I believe later in life his time as actor or film producer he didn't have much longevity. I believe he may have worked for Vanity Fair later in life. So,
interesting.
It seemed that fashion was in his blood. A lot of people talk about his resemblance to H.P. Lovecraft.
Oh right, yeah.
Which isn't particularly meaningful to me, but of course this is one of those films where I suppose Lovecraft could technically have seen it,
yeah.
Although he'd have probably seen the terrible recut version that showed in the US, Castle of Doom.
Maybe we should talk about that first of all, about the kind of crazy production history of this and the various different versions, right? And it was filmed in sort of several different languages, is that right? In different versions, and then sort of parts of all of the versions have sort of been lost, is that right?
It's very, very tangled altogether. So I shall try to offer as concise a description as I can. So Carl Dreyer, his previous film was The Passion of Joan of Arc, which was certainly acclaimed by some as an artistic triumph, but lost an awful lot of money. It was a financial disaster. So the production company behind that tried to wriggle out of their contract with Dreyer. They had agreed to produce 2 of his films. They wanted to drop him after that one, obviously not wanting to lose any more money. So Dreyer then took them to court. This consumed a lot of his time, a lot of his creative energy, and also led him towards this resolution that he would only ever work independently as a filmmaker from that point on. So he found Julian West, the Baron, clearly hatched this deal with him for him to star in and finance Vampyr, and off they went, making essentially 3 films simultaneously. Because they had this ambitious scheme to make it exportable by filming it in 3 different languages. They would do an English version, a French version, and a German version. This goes some way to explaining why dialogue is not in any way sustained in this film.
No.
It was shot as a silent film,
yeah,
and everything was looped afterwards, everything was added in. Although there are odd wrinkles in all of this, in that, to the greatest extent possible, Dreyer would film each actor mouthing the words in each of the 3 languages for every shot where their lips are seen to move. But regardless of whether that actor was proficient in that language or not, this had terrible repercussions for the edit as well, where obviously doing these alternate takes, the actors' performances would run a slightly different time on each occasion. So
yes.
in some of the in certain versions of the film, the editors, clearly in a panic, are dropping black frames in to make up the time and keep the soundtrack in sync. There are certain moments where they clearly didn't bother to do the alternate language version. So in every single version of the film, when the vampire woman, Marguerite, enters the barn and cries, "Stop!" in relation to the dancing shadows, she's doing it in German in every version of the film. So it's incredibly tangled, and it got more and more tangled even after everything was in the can and everything was edited in no matter how strange a format. Its release was delayed, so it came out after Universal's Dracula, and at least in Dreyer's view, suffered very unfairly from comparisons with Dracula, which is such a shame because Dracula is it's not even on the same planet cinematically as Vampyr. You know, if one was to suffer, you would rather hope it would be Dracula, but that was not the way it went. Like Nosferatu, this film has been very, very hard to access in the English language. I mean, as far as I'm aware, the version made for English speakers doesn't exist anymore. Certainly it hasn't been released. So I don't imagine it exists in a watchable form, which is a great shame because Dreyer had bent over backwards to ensure this film would be watched without subtitles. There is an English version, a terrible recut that I mentioned, Castle of Doom. It's on YouTube. I could only get through a few minutes. It's so incompetently, terribly done. And it's really, really sad to think that this work of such artistic magnificence was, seen by people in this really bastardised, really schlocky form. It's a terrible, terrible tragedy. I mean, I think now at least we are seeing something very, very close to what Dreyer intended.
Yes.
There are certain cuts in the film, there are tantalising stills we have of material that isn't in there, but as far as I can tell, Dreyer himself deleted those scenes. So there's a still that comes up quite a lot of one of the sisters sleeping on a bench, and there's this shadow of a scythe above her. Doesn't appear in the film. There's an even more exciting still, where the vampire woman is summoning some wolves to do her bidding. Equally, that was cut. Probably too melodramatic a highlight, too Draculian a touch for this much more grey story of the supernatural. So yes,
Wow.
I suppose after all of that, probably the big barrier we come up against is just the quality of what remains. I haven't seen the latest restoration. I'm excited.
Yes, there's a new one coming about 2 weeks, annoyingly, after this episode goes out. Yeah, I think the end of May, beginning of June, there's a nice new Eureka Blu-ray, I believe.
A nice shiny Blu-ray.
Yeah.
Although, again, it's a bit like Nosferatu in that this is kind of one of those examples of a film where I don't want to see it over-restored. I can't imagine Vampyr being cleaner than in its current form. And of course this will pose nightmares for film restoration teams, because so much of the image is already diffuse and elided.
I know.
You know, if you were to just run it through a computer, you would lose everything that's distinctive and beautiful about it. Mm-hmm. It's like when film restoration teams have to digitally clean up a scene in a film with fog, or a scene with rain, lots of noise, lots of artefacts already there.
Yeah.
And it becomes very hard to separate the artefacts that should be there from the artefacts that shouldn't.
Right,
and
yeah.
I imagine Vampyr in this respect is just a nightmare from top to bottom to restore.
Yes,
but,
yes, absolutely.
Yes. I do want it to retain its fogginess.
Yeah, agreed. It's all part of the vibe of this movie, isn't it?
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about that vibe, about Dreyer's direction. You've talked already about how some of the images are so striking, and it's unbelievable, isn't it? I think that I feels like there are images from this film that will sort of stay with you forever after you've seen it. But what do you think of just the visuals, and I suppose the visual storytelling of this film?
There's nothing like it, is there?
No.
And it's so different to our received idea of a horror film, in that it's got very little to do with the dark.
Yes.
In fact, Dreyer's aesthetic is light obsessed. More than that, it's white obsessed, and this just suffuses all of the imagery, overwhelmingly so, especially as the film reaches its conclusion. And I can't think of many examples in the horror film, or indeed wider horror media, that come close to that.
Yeah.
In fact, the thing that comes closest in my head is early PlayStation version of Silent Hill.
Yes.
Where so much of roaming around the landscape, you're coming up against a wall of fog.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah.
It's obviously a graphical limitation in something like Silent Hill, but it's made into a great stylistic virtue, and it's absolutely a virtue in Vampyr.
Yeah.
There's an interesting point of comparison with Nosferatu in that nighttime, it's kind of non-existent.
Yes.
In Dreyer's landscape, it serves to convert it into a kind of dreamscape. There is the odd genuine night shot in Nosferatu, but curiously enough, never when the vampire is on screen.
Yes. Yeah.
And we certainly know that swathes of Vampyr are meant to be set at night. We know this from the programme notes that accompany the film's premiere. But then you watch the film, and there's simply no evidence of this. Everything takes place in this sort of perpetual... It's not quite daylight, but equally it's very far from nighttime. I think basically what it's doing is, if most horror films depict the underworld, this is like a kind of overworld, to coin a phrase. It's flooded with light, and there's this constant sense of everything's turned upside down or topsy-turvy, most clearly shown in how the shadows are at play. You see the shadow undigging a grave.
Yeah, that's very strange, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a part of this topsy-turvy thing, this idea of misrule, other shadows will just leave their owners and walk about on their own. You even have the extraordinary moment where a shadow appears to shoot someone to death.
Yes.
Everything is completely out of control and the wrong way round. So in the same way we feel we should be looking at darkness, we're seeing light. Every element of the film embodies that kind of chaos of a complete reversal of what's natural, what should be going on.
Yeah, I think it was Kim, when he wrote about it, Kim Newman, who compared it more, less to other vampire films like Dracula and more to movies like Un Chien Andalou, right? That it is just this bafflingly experimental visual, play with the form almost, more than anything. And everything about this film, you're right, the light, the editing, it feels designed to kind of completely disorientate you, I think.
It's utterly singular. And it's utterly singular even in the context of Carl Dreyer's wider filmography.
Yeah.
He didn't direct any of a film that looks anything like this.
Yeah.
I suppose you can look at things like The Passion of Joan of Arc and pick out the whiteness of so many of the backgrounds in that film.
Yeah.
The use of light, the almost blinding commitment to light, even in situations that on the surface seem to call for darkness. That's an inquisition, that's a trial. You imagine that in dark dungeons, but no, instead it's white backgrounds.
Have you seen by any chance Robert Eggers' The Lighthouse yet? Have you had a chance to watch that?
Oh, yes.
Because I don't know. I mean, maybe we'll talk a bit about this later, about this film's influence on other filmmakers, but I feel like there's a lot of Robert Eggers, there's a lot of Vampyr in Robert Eggers' work, and there is a moment in that black and white fever dream movie where they reach the top of the lighthouse at the end, and the movie literally...
I was just going to say.
Yes, everything kind of dips to white, and this kind of extreme kind of white noise, literally that sort of comes about. It reminded me a bit of that for some reason. But
it's funny, isn't it? The extremes in either direction, black or white.
Yes,
it does amount to a kind of oblivion, and it's terrifying.
Yeah,
truly
absolutely.
Terrifying.
And as well as that, as well as the light, as well as the disorientation of it, just stunning. I guess you'd call them visual effects too, right? In this movie, that's the other thing that, again, it's compared to maybe some of the movies that we were getting, from Universal even at this time, that were a little bit more, wide shots and people moving around rooms in more of a kind of theatrical way. This is, again, it just feels very alive. I love that about it. It's the camera moves, it pans, there are close-ups, there are canted angles, there are half-transparent people, and there are people turning into skeletons, or there are, heads in windows and all this kind of stuff. And it's just, it's a visual feast for the eyes, isn't it, this movie?
It's absolutely gorgeous. I often cheat with this kind of thing. I could describe my favourite moment in Vampyr as being, I like that shot where there's a skull.
Yeah, yes, exactly. That one shot. I mean,
it's not every shot of the film, but it does. It's an image that recurs again very, very obsessively. The film itself is not only a sustained kind of memento mori; it's got these little memento moris scattered about. And I think those skulls, played in the way they are, often given some very subtle movement in the frame or lighting up, it really does go along with the thing that's also in Nosferatu, the vampire feeling less fleshly than ghostly.
Yes.
And this climaxes, of course, with the vampire's destruction, which I feel is a really beautiful moment.
Yeah, agreed. Let's talk a little bit about the, like you said, there's something so ghostly about this vampire. And I said to you yesterday, I said, this movie almost could have gone in a cult series of this podcast or a ghost series of this podcast,
Yes,
because the vampire
definitely.
itself, I mean, let's talk about the vampire. I guess sort of how the vampires work, the vampire mythology, the vampire lore, and we get kind of glimpses of it through kind of prose, don't we, on screen, kind of explanations as the vampire.
I do have to say, I find the vampire of the title, the Vampyr, Marguerite Chopin, I do find the character genuinely frightening. It's very, very unexpected. Right from her entrance, where she just comes unexpectedly around the corner.
Yes.
Again, it's this thing of the monster coming at you from far away, and Gray runs. He runs around the corner, and because of the bizarre way the film is cut together, you don't get a sense of whether she's gotten remotely close to catching up with him. In fact, you don't even get a sense of whether she's seen him. That's so much of the oddity in how characters relate to each other in this film. There's a kind of exterior or even the kind of interior blindness that dictates so many of their relations. So that scene sticks in my mind. It's possibly the closest I've seen in any film to something that really captures that fundamental nightmare essence of I'm trying to run away from something, but it's coming after me and I can't stop it.
Yes.
She does have this aura of frailty, which is very compelling. I know they did intend to make the vampire blind at one point. They don't quite seem to have committed to that in the film as made, and it's not entirely clear why, but she still retains this kind of aura of blindness, or I suppose helplessness. She has these enablers surrounding her to help her hold power, and they they amount to a kind of unholy trinity, don't they? It's not only the vampire, but it's the doctor and the soldier in conjunction with the vampire.
Yes.
And yeah, strange visual quality. I don't mean to at all be ungallant to the actress, but certainly when I first looked at stills from this film prior to seeing it, I did assume it was an old man. But I think this is one of the things with extreme age, isn't it? A kind of androgynous quality, which can be very unsettling. And certainly the way they've costumed her with the ceremonial chain and the shocks of white hair, she looks very much like a French monarch. She looks like Louis XI or someone.
Yes.
But that to me is a very intriguing visual direction in which to go with the vampire. And of course, hanging over it all, as you mentioned, Mike, this quality of the vampire as ghost.
Yeah.
It's the thing that makes the destruction so beautiful. She fades away like a ghost, and in this entirely or almost entirely topsy-turvy film, we finally see things as they really are. She is dead, and she now appears as dead.
Yeah.
It's kind of reassuring.
Yeah, that's right. Because actually, because they explain, don't they, that she was she like her body was preserved for 100 years, like appeared preserved after 100 years of being buried or something like that. Initially.
Well, it's so interesting, isn't it? The very lengthy chunks of the film that are taken up with another book of the vampires. It's not Nosferatu's book of the vampires, but you almost feel it's gesturing towards a shared universe. And we get swaths and swaths of text, which should give us information about the vampires, but curiously, it's a peculiar process by which the more sort of factual information we get or appear to get about the vampires, the less certain everything seems in terms of setting out a vampire lore.
Yes.
How does one become a vampire, for instance? I think as you point out, Mike, there's a certain sense that if you lead an incredibly evil life and you have nothing to do with the church and the church will have nothing to do with you, you may carry on as a vampire. You may persist in that form. But there doesn't seem to be a clear sense in which you can become a vampire from being bitten. As far as I can tell, the scheme with the ailing sister, the ailing, largely bedridden sister, is to weaken her, to crush her spirit, and then to convince her to commit suicide.
Yes, and sort of take her soul or something.
Yeah, that little bottle of poison, which again has a skull on.
Yeah, that's great.
So as in Nosferatu, there's a sense of a vampire being something more symbolic, which goes hand in hand with the ghostly properties. It's a more spiritual evil than an evil that really obeys strict laws and rules and dictates.
Yes, and we don't see a whole lot of Marguerite initially, and you're right, it's people like the Doctor, right, that are kind of doing the vampire's bidding, I suppose, who we see trying to poison the sister. But what do you make of that weird, very creepy, iconic moment where the sister sort of turns or changes and smiles and stares, that incredible close-up of her where something kind of switches within her or something at that moment? Like, is she turning into a vampire? What's happening there at that moment?
It's odd, isn't it? Because you feel she's on the cusp of transforming into a vampire.
Yes.
There.
Yes.
It feels like, for the very first time in film history, we're seeing that imagery effectively laid out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's certainly nothing in Helen Chandler in Dracula, bless her, that comes close to that for effectiveness when she's almost turning into a vampire. But then it's forgotten about. I wonder in a way if it's more akin to a demonic possession.
Yes.
There's something about her range of facial expressions in that remind me very strongly of Linda Blair in The Exorcist.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's an explanation as such, but it's tremendously effective.
It's very chilling, isn't it?
I find it, legitimately, genuinely very, very chilling.
Yeah.
Very unsettling.
Yeah.
And, thank God that Dreyer, although he'd largely committed to using amateur actors in this film, he did seek out a few professionals, and there we have one of them. And it pays off. And I suppose as well, this is one of the areas of film where we can connect it to Dreyer's larger filmography, in that it's a very tight, very appreciative close-up of a human face.
Yes.
I mean, The Passion of Joan of Arc is comprised of almost nothing but close-ups of the human face.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Dreyer in interviews always said that, there is nothing that is more photographically exciting than the human face. There is nothing more changeable, more amorphous, more mercurial. He really believed in the powers of the face, which makes it all the more interesting in this film that close-ups are few and far between, really.
Right, yeah.
But that is a really outstanding moment of terror.
And I agree with him. I mean, facial expressions, particularly in older movies, like I automatically find it so much more engaging, when we have close-ups and that kind of thing.
Yes,
and they work so well in this, yeah.
It's the suggestive quality, isn't it? And
yeah.
In all of the older film books that talk about Vampyr, they all seem to, I don't know if it's like a case of mass recycling and forming a paper trail in that way, but they all seem to come back to the same Dreyer quotation, which is him setting out his ethos for Vampyr. Which is, and I'm paraphrasing here, but his idea was very much, imagine we're all sitting in a room. It's a perfectly ordinary room. You are then told that behind the door is a dead body in the next room. Now, all of a sudden, nothing has changed in your immediate surroundings, and yet everything has changed. Everything is transformed and unsettled and off-centre. That is the feeling I want to get in Vampyr.
Oh, that's
And
brilliant.
I think he succeeded.
That's brilliant,
I think he more than succeeded. There is a dead body behind the door in every single shot of that film.
Well, yes, and this is when I have to drop my favourite person in the world, which is David Lynch, because I feel like David Lynch must have loved this film, because I feel like the kind of weird atmosphere in this movie is exactly what you get in some of the best works of Lynch, which is that I don't quite know what's going on, but I have a horrible feeling something dreadful is about to happen at any moment. And like that's one of my favourite things to experience in film sometimes, that it's speaking to me in a language where it's not necessarily needing to use words to tell me what's going on, but somehow it is conveying exactly what it wants you to feel, like what it wants to convey, and making you feel exactly what it wants you to feel, and that's the genius of this film, I think.
Yes, and it does it in such a nimble running time as compared to the films of David Lynch.
That's very true. That's very true.
I love certain David Lynch films, but I wish almost all of them could be slightly shorter than they are, because then I would do the thing I want to do with David Lynch's films, which is to return to them and get more out of them every time.
Yeah, you're right. They're all 2+ hours, aren't they? Whereas this is a swift 73 minutes, I think it is.
70 odd. Yeah,
lovely, absolutely lovely. But I love all of that about it. I love its mood. It is just absolute pure mood, isn't it?
It's very Twin Peaks, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think of that particularly at the start of the film, where you have the terrifying moment with the blind man coming down the stairs, and Gray locks himself away. It's never discussed. It never returns in any form. It just, that's it.
Yes.
That feels remarkably Twin Peaks to me. And I suppose, like Dreyer, Lynch has shown a dedication to diffusing his image to get a greater effect, hasn't he? You think of Inland Empire, where it's all filmed on sort of low-grade stock, and
that is
way.
A difficult film to get to sit through, to be fair, isn't it? I think that's over 3 hours, and that is a very tricky film to watch. But
you'll watch 3 of Vampyr in that time.
Exactly. And
I would.
I mean, you kind of have to, don't you? Let's talk a bit about Alan Gray, or David Gray, but Alan Gray, because he's really interesting. Like you say, he doesn't really do much. He seems to basically always be on screen, really, and he is introduced at the beginning as being a man who has, an interest in the occult and everything. So you kind of think, is he the reason this is happening? Like, has he got something to do with it? Or is that just, but it's the way that he's set up, and then ultimately how little he does is kind of interesting, isn't it? What do you think of Alan Gray?
Well, he's fascinating more for his potential impact on, as you say, the nature of the entire film, than for anything he actually does. Because he is the lens through which we view nearly all of the film's events.
Yes.
And the fact that there is a nearly there is what unsettles everything. Because it would be a very neat explanation for this film's wraparound weirdness if he was constantly there and we felt, okay, we're sort of getting the world of Vampyr such as it is, but filtered through Gray's person. We're getting a subjective experience here communicated to us through Vampyr. Now that falls apart slightly because there is the odd exception where he isn't there and the film is just as strange as it was previously.
Yeah.
So, for example, the scene where the vampire... the vampire gives the bottle of poison to the doctor.
Yes.
Gray has gone off on his own path by then, but we're still left there in the office watching this transaction. And then similar later on when the vampire's been destroyed and all hell is breaking loose, Gray is going off with one of the sisters through the mists, on the boat, into the forests, and we're meanwhile seeing, again, without Gray being there, the deaths of the soldier and the doctor.
Yes, that incredible moment, yeah.
Yeah, remarkable, really, really remarkable. But we can't then apply, as a kind of get-out clause, we are seeing events subjectively portrayed.
Yes, because you could almost think that you're in Alan's dream or something, right? I mean, you could argue that, but yes.
It certainly can't be applied in a rigorous and logical fashion.
No.
Which I don't mind.
No.
But it's... Yeah, there's no ultimate answer. I wonder in a way if kind of the heart of all of this is that scene, which doesn't seem to serve any narrative function, but is the scene without which it would be impossible to conceive a Vampyr, which is when Gray is in the coffin, and we get what is a definitive subjective camera looking up from the coffin.
Yes.
So that is a definitive moment in the film where we are seeing events through his eyes.
Yes.
And the interesting thing that's happened there is Gray has been split in 3 or possibly 4 directions.
Yeah.
So he's fallen asleep on a bench. So that's the first version of Gray. Then he's left himself as a kind of translucent version. So that's a second version.
Yeah.
This translucent version then sees Gray in the coffin.
Yeah.
So that's presumably a third version.
Yeah.
And then there's a sort of... terrible pun. There's a kind of grey area. Is there a 4th version of Gray when suddenly we're in the coffin looking out?
Right, yeah. Yeah.
It gets very diffused. There are maybe 3.5 versions of Gray.
Yes, and are any of those versions real as well? Because then Gray is not dead at the end of the film in a coffin, is he? So it's very strange.
No.
You know.
But that to me, if we were looking for the key to the secrets of how to decode Vampyr, that would seem to me to be the place to start. But as I think I've already mentioned, I have no desire to solve this film's mysteries. You know,
No.
This is what keeps me coming back. And we'll never know. We will never know. But I do enjoy how redundant Gray is. As you know, he's certainly no great romantic hero. About the only really effective thing he does, if we exempt the destruction of the vampire, which of course isn't in the print of the film that's most widely circulated. You know, he does untie the sister quite near the end. Although even there, we only see his hands come into the frame and do it. It's almost as though Dreyer doesn't want us to pay too much attention to anything Gray does of his own steam. And apart from that, he's just sort of failing to do anything useful. I'm always rather amused by the scene where the father, the kind of master of the chateau, is dying, having been shot by a shadow, and he just reaches out for a sort of what is presumably a quite stale, quite cold cup of tea, and gets the spoon and just kind of moistens his lips slightly. It's like, well, that's not really going to help us, is it, Gray? But I suppose we all have our abilities, and if your ability is to spoon weak tea into the mouth of a dying man, I shall not stand in your way.
No, exactly. You do you. But I think he has, I guess, maybe also a bit of a every person, every man quality to him. Like is he us essentially? I suppose as this kind of just sort of onlooker to what's going on in this. I
suppose it's a bit like the problem of Harry Potter, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Though less transphobic.
Yes.
Where he is just boring and grey.
Yes.
He's literally grey. It's in his name.
Yeah.
Because he has to be the lens through which we view events.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, that interest in the occult or whatever, again, that could be us. That's us sitting down to watch a film called Vampyr, I suppose. You could almost put it that way. Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, there we go. Anything else you want to mention? I suppose what I haven't asked you about yet is we've talked about the visuals a lot, but I guess we should talk about the sound in this as well. The dialogue and the sound, of which there is very little, right? This is Dreyer's first sound film, but it's not really, is it? And I almost wonder, would this have been better just as a completely silent film? I don't know. What do you think of the kind of the few moments of dialogue that we get in this?
Well, it's so odd that you asked the question of whether it would be better as a silent film, because I've seen it presented as a silent film.
Right.
A few Halloweens ago, the Early Music Centre in York had a screening of Vampyr with a pianist accompanying it. Mm-hmm. So what they did, very cannily, was to just turn the sound off on Vampyr, have the subtitles on, of course, and, this pianist accompanied it, and, it was really rather effective. And yeah, you do see Vampyr infiltrating lists of great silent horror films occasionally. I think people have a slightly misguided idea that this film was intended to be silent, and then sound was kind of retroactively added on top.
Yeah.
It's not actually the case, but it is a legacy of how strange the production of this film was, that it feels like a silent film even though it isn't.
Yes, yeah.
It was calculated to be as free from spoken language as is possible, so very often when you hear dialogue, you can't see the mouth of the character who's speaking it. Which, of course, only contributes to this sense of dislocation you get in the film, of not being able to quite get your bearings at any moment. And, those long lingering glimpses of the vampire book we mentioned, and even at the start intertitles, they're quite clever get-outs for Dreyer in terms of doing his multi-language thing.
Yeah.
You can just photograph a book of the vampires in English, and then in French, and then in German.
Yeah.
It's much easier than poking your poor amateur actors into speaking three languages that perhaps they don't understand.
Yes.
I really don't think this would be improved were we to completely lose the soundtrack, though. Because I find the sound design in this film so remarkably sinister.
Yes, it is.
And I think it's so important to emphasise that all of that is a choice on the part of the filmmakers, and not just a product of the film's great age.
Yeah.
I think if you're not that familiar with older films, particularly older sound films, you could watch Vampyr and think, oh, well, it sounds like that because it's technically limited, and all the films being made at that time probably sounded like that. No film has ever sounded quite like Vampyr. It's all very carefully done. And I got to thinking, this time watching it as well, you have possibly the first great musical score in horror film history, in the music by the composer with the wonderful name Wolfgang Zeller. Because there's quite a lot of music in Vampyr.
There is. As
compared to other films. I mean, there are other films that came out in 1932 which have a fair amount of incidental music. You think of things like The Mummy or The Most Dangerous Game, but with Vampyr, it's a wonderful thing that you perhaps more associate with films of a later period where the music and the film seem to be in absolute harmony.
Yes, absolutely.
Like has found like, and they belong to each other and enhance and enrich each other. So I think the score is something of a neglected masterpiece. I'd love to hear it played by an orchestra, just to try and tease out the complexity of it.
Yeah, and you're right about those other moments of sound. It really adds something, because it's sort of weird and, again, jarring. The sudden gunshot, for example, or when somebody does suddenly call someone's name, or, whatever it might be, these kind of strange little moments of sound just make the whole thing even more unsettling, I think, at times.
That's definitely the case. There's an exchange fairly early on. I think it's actually the first meeting of Grey and the Doctor. And again, it's one of those moments of inner or outer, or some combination of the two, blindness, where the Doctor would logically appear to have seen Grey, but then moves past him as though he's sort of looked beyond him and doesn't, but at the same time isn't surprised when Grey does engage him in conversation. And they have this bizarre exchange where Grey is talking about a child crying out, and also the howl of a dog or a wolf, I think.
That's right, yeah.
Neither of which I believe we've heard watching the film.
No.
Or if we have heard them, they've been so caught up in the bizarre sound design that it doesn't leap forward clearly. And then the Doctor just denies knowledge of these things. Maybe again it goes back to this idea of Grey creating the weirdness surrounding him.
Yeah.
Longing for events to be tinged in the occult and finding that wherever he goes.
Yeah. Well, there we go. Anything we've missed? Anything you want to mention before we wrap up on Vampyr?
There's nothing that leaps out for me. I just entreat all and sundry to go and watch it. Even if you don't particularly care for films of this age, I feel Vampyr has come of age.
It has, yeah, absolutely, in the way Nosferatu did.
Yes,
yeah,
entirely.
I agree, and but in a very different way, right?
Very different.
I guess,
and in fact, Julian West in after years, it's hard to tell how much this factored in at the time, or if at all. But he said he had seen Nosferatu, and he was determined that their film be nothing like Nosferatu. Nosferatu to him was a dirty word. It was an obvious take on the vampire myth, and. I don't know if Dreyer ever expressed an opinion on Nosferatu, though I'm almost certain he'll have seen it, because he and Murnau were contemporaries. It's the odd irony, though, that they're so often bracketed together, as they have been on this episode.
As they have been this week. It's so funny, isn't it? But they're so different, and it's like one is the kind of early example of real classic horror, and the other is an early example of art house, I would say, really. But
Nosferatu and Vampyr kind of belong to each other in some strange way. And
yes.
I'm very sorry, Baron, if that offends you, and you're probably going to have to spoon a lot of weak tea into corpses' mouths in order to get me to in any way relent there. I do always mentally bracket these films together. Yeah.
Do you see, we talked about how much Nosferatu had this incredible influence where you basically could trace back every monster movie since to Nosferatu in some way or another. Has Vampyr had any kind of impact or legacy in a similar way, or is it just entirely its own little weird beast?
I think the latter.
Yeah,
really.
Yeah.
There's the odd film, which I've rewatched recently, hoping it would cast more reflected light back onto Vampyr, but nothing really comes close. I looked again at Bergman's Hour of the Wolf, for example.
I think there is a bit of a Bergman vibe about this film, actually. I was going to mention him, yeah.
Well, I'd heard Hour of the Wolf mentioned a bit recently as being a vampire film, which shocked me, because I'd watched it before, and that had not leapt out at me in any way, shape or form as an element there. And again, watching it, I could not really see any obvious vampiric content, but what primarily struck me was how very, very different of a universe of Vampyr it is. Bergman's imagery is pin-sharp.
Yes.
There's none of that with Dreyer. Everything is diffused. So I don't think there really are any followers to Vampyr. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, there is one Bergman film that sprang to mind. Have you seen Persona?
No, I haven't.
That is not at all really a classic kind of horror film, although it has got some very strange moments, but it's equally as incomprehensible as Vampyr. And also, it's been a few years since I've seen it, but it is bathed in white light, and it is quite diffused, and in that regard, it does stick out from some of his other movies. And weirdly, again, talking about these kind of inspirations, but Persona is one of David Lynch's favourite films as well, and it inspired a lot of his movies, and it's a lot about identities merging and characters kind of shifting and changing and all of that kind of thing, and again kind of very deliberately disorientating, but it does slightly have that more sort of washed out look in the way that Vampyr does, but again that could be a complete coincidence, who knows.
Well, it could be, but I feel I must seek out Persona forthwith. Is it as commendably short as Vampyr?
It's not. Actually, no? I don't think it's too long. I think it's under 2 hours, but it is. It's not an easy film in some regards, but it is excellent. It is excellent.
Okay.
Wonderful. Well, James, as ever, it's been such a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for being here. And just before we go, just remind anyone if there's anything you've got coming up, any upcoming films or anything else that people should be keeping a lookout for. Let us know.
I don't really know, and anything I'm involved in is having a screening, to be perfectly honest, apart from Dashcam, which you should all see at the Genesis Cinema.
Yes.
And has now probably sold out, so why I'm saying this, I don't know. yes, keep watching the screens. Something with my macabre person in it will be sliding out of the darkness. Or if it's Dreyer associated, the whiteness very, very soon, I hope.
Perfect. James, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Mike.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to this week's fantastic guest. Always such a treat to have him on. It's James Swanton. So let us know what you thought of this week's episode and what you think of these two beautiful films, two of my absolute favourite early horror movies, Nosferatu and Vampyr. Get in touch. You can email us, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials. Don't forget, you can also discuss this week's episode and anything else horror related with fellow listeners, either on our discussion group on Facebook, that's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, or on the Evolution of Horror Discord. If you want to sign up to our Patreon for bonus episodes, it's patreon.com/evolution of horror. And you can find this podcast on all the usual podcast platforms. And as ever, we'd be so grateful if you could spare a moment to drop us a little rating or review on Apple Podcasts, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. All right, onwards and upwards to next week then, and it's time to finally make our way into the world of Universal monster movies. Next week, I'm going to be joined by filmmaker Axel Carolyn, and we are going to be discussing Dracula from 1931, starring Bela Lugosi. And not only that, we'll be talking about many of the sequels during the Universal era that followed, including Dracula's Daughter, Son of Dracula, and of course, Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. Cannot wait. Join us again soon for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.